our country has adequate deposits of coltan. And for those of us who are not technical, coltan is a mineral which is responsible for your communication gadgets, the cameras you are using, the phones you are using, the laptops, and any other communication material. Coltan is a key mineral that facilitates those particular gadgets.
Communities in Kenya's coast are worried as international powers, including the United States and China, show interest in Marima Hill's rare earth deposits. The locals are now fearing eviction or missing out on future mining profits.
I have a bit of a problem with some of our friends, but it is what I must do for Kenya. You know, it's in the best interest of Kenya that we get into this market. Some of our friends are complaining that we are doing too much trade with China. Honestly, I mean, you know, when I sat with President Xi, I had a very candid conversation, and I told him that Kenya is importing 600 billion of products from China. Yet we are only exporting maybe 300 or 5%, according to Lee. You know, that trade imbalance is serious. And that is the reason why they have opened up their market for our agricultural products.
Communities on Kenya's coast are on edge as the world's major powers, including the United States and China, show interest in Marima Hill. The forest is rich in rare earth minerals, which are crucial for technology and industry globally. Locals, mostly from the Digo ethnic group, worry about eviction and losing a share in future mining profits.
I hear there are very valuable minerals here, which could sustain the entire country of Kenya, worth trillions of shillings. Why should we suffer if there are valuable minerals here in Marima? If there are valuable minerals, we are not opposed to the mountain being mined.
Something massive just shifted in global power, and it didn't happen in Washington or Beijing. It happened quietly in Kenya. Behind closed doors, analysts are putting a number on it. $62 billion, not a bailout, not aid, strategic value. The US is watching, China is already positioned, and Kenya has suddenly become too important to ignore. This isn't about headlines, it's about supply chains, minerals, ports, and who controls the routes that decide the next decade of global trade. Once you understand why Kenya moved to the center of this fight, the world map looks very different. For years, Kenya occupied a familiar role in global economics, important but not indispensable. Strategic but rarely urgent. A country discussed in development terms rather than power calculations. That era just ended. The shift didn't come from a single discovery announced with fanfare. It came from convergence. Multiple forces collided at the same moment. Global instability, supply chain fragmentation, and resource scarcity in Kenya happened to sit at the intersection of all of them. That's how the $62 billion valuation emerged. Not from one mine or one commodity, but from Kenya's growing role as a strategic platform in a world that suddenly values reliability over loyalty and access over ideology. The global economy entered this decade already strained. Pandemic disruptions broke assumptions about efficiency. Geopolitical conflicts turned energy and food into weapons. Tariffs introduced uncertainty where stability once existed. Climate shocks added another layer of unpredictability. Companies didn't wait for governments to resolve these problems. They adapted. Quietly, priorities changed. Cost mattered less than continuity. Speed mattered less than certainty. And trust in traditional supply routes began to erode. That's where Kenya entered the conversation. Kenya offered something increasingly rare: connection without isolation. It wasn't under heavy sanctions. It wasn't locked into one geopolitical camp, and it sat at the center of East Africa's most important trade corridors. The port of Mombasa transformed from a regional hub into a strategic gateway. Goods moving through it didn't just serve Kenya, they fed entire inland economies. Uganda, Rwanda, South Sudan, Eastern Congo, flows that mattered to manufacturers far beyond Africa. At the same time, proximity to critical resources became impossible to ignore. The modern economy doesn't run on finished products alone. It runs on inputs: cobalt, lithium, nickel, rare earth-related minerals, industrial metals, and energy materials that power everything from electric vehicles to defense systems. Kenya didn't need to own every resource outright. Control over movement, processing, and access carried its own weight. Logistics mattered as much as extraction. Infrastructure mattered as much as ownership. That's how analysts stopped looking for a single asset and started pricing an ecosystem. Ports connected to rail, rail connected to industrial zones connected to global buyers, value layered on value. Meanwhile, the West faced an uncomfortable reality. Rebuilding domestic supply chains was slow, expensive, and politically contested. Environmental permitting dragged on, labor costs soared, timelines stretched in 2 years. Kenya offered immediacy. China understood this early. Its engagement wasn't driven by announcements or ideology. It was driven by arithmetic, long-term port access, rail financing, industrial parks, trade facilitation. When trade tensions with the United States intensified, those investments quietly matured into strategic insulation. Supply routes existed, relationships were built, alternatives were ready. By the time Western policymakers started talking seriously about de-risking, the market had already adjusted. That's why the competition unfolding now feels oddly silent. No dramatic trade bans, no emergency summits, just feasibility studies, infrastructure bids, long-term supply agreements, and logistical negotiations happening largely out of public view. And Kenya isn't rushing. That's the critical difference, because Kenya doesn't need to choose sides. In a polarized global economy, neutrality isn't weakness, it's leverage. Competition between major powers improves terms. Multiple suitors increase bargaining power. Optionality becomes currency. For Kenyan policymakers and regional partners, this moment represents something new. Deals are no longer framed as desperation plays. They're negotiated from a position of relevance. The West's sudden interest isn't rooted in charity or diplomacy. It's rooted in math. Supply chains need anchors. Trade routes need reliability. Strategic industries need inputs that won't vanish with the next political dispute. Kenya checks those boxes, and once a country becomes embedded into global trade architecture at that level, reversal becomes costly. Infrastructure shapes behavior. Capital locks in relationships. Trust compounds. That's why the $62 billion figure matters. Not because it's flashy, but because it signals permanence. Kenya didn't just attract attention. It crossed a threshold. It moved from the margins to the middle of global trade strategy. And once that happens, the balance of power doesn't shift with speeches. It shifts with shipping manifests, long-term contracts, and routes that never quite go back the way they were. In the next act, the focus turns to what exactly the US and China are competing over, how leverage is being priced, and why this quiet contest may define Africa's role in the global economy far longer than anyone expected. Once Kenya crossed into strategic relevance, behavior around it shifted not in speeches but in movement. Budgets were quietly adjusted, logistics plans were rewritten, delegations arrived without press releases. When global powers sense long-term leverage, they stop talking and start positioning. That's exactly what happened. Kenya became less about diplomacy and more about access. The concern in Washington was never an immediate loss of influence. It was the risk of losing options. In a world where supply chains fracture under pressure, the greatest vulnerability is dependence without alternatives, and alternatives depend on geography, reliability, and control over movement, not ideology. Kenya sits at the center of one of those calculations. The Indian Ocean routes running through East Africa are becoming more valuable as instability grows elsewhere. Red Sea disruptions, Middle East volatility, and Asian congestion forced planners to abandon old assumptions. Efficiency no longer meant shortest distance. It meant highest reliability under stress. That shift elevated Kenya's position almost overnight. From the port of Mombasa, goods don't just travel inland, they move predictably. Predictability has become the most valuable asset in global trade. Not speed, not cost, certainty. Kenya offered it when others couldn't. China recognized this early. Its approach avoided headlines and focused on continuity. Infrastructure investment wasn't symbolic, it was functional. Rail, ports, roads, and digital systems were designed to work as one, not to control the system, but to integrate into it. Once a system works, businesses don't argue ideology, they follow efficiency, and once businesses commit, governments adjust. That's how leverage grows without confrontation. For Kenya, this moment created an unusual advantage. Instead of reacting to offers, it could structure them. Instead of bundling influence, it separated it. Logistics agreements here, industrial investment there. Energy deals negotiated independently from transport access. This fragmentation mattered. It prevented any single partner from dominating the full value chain. It kept leverage dispersed and negotiable. Meanwhile, Western firms faced a lag. Executives understood Kenya's importance, but policy alignment moved slower. The result wasn't withdrawal, but hesitation. markets moved ahead of governments, and supply chains rerouted while strategy discussions continued. By the time public attention caught up, momentum had already formed. That's when the $62 billion valuation took shape. Not as a single discovery, not as instant wealth, but as an aggregation of advantage, logistics savings, risk reduction, lower insurance costs, stable throughput, proximity to processing, faster turnaround when disruptions hit elsewhere. These gains don't make headlines, but they transform competitiveness. Kenya's regional reach amplified that value further. It wasn't just a domestic node. It became a gateway into neighboring economies rich in resources but limited in export capacity. Access expanded beyond borders. Kenya wasn't the prize, it was the pathway, and pathways define who controls flow. The competition sharpened, but not over territory, over standards. Who sets operating norms? Who defines technical specifications? Who shapes financing rules? Standards determine lock-in, and lock-in outlasts leadership cycles and policy shifts. China arrived early. The West arrived determined. Kenya arrived patient. That patience paid dividends. Multiple partners meant better terms. Competing timelines meant faster execution. Parallel investments reduced dependency. Kenya didn't need to say no, it only needed to wait. In the background, global pressures converged, energy transitions accelerated, climate risk intensified, demographics reshaped labor markets. Every trend pointed toward securing stable access to resources and routes. Kenya offered proximity without entanglement, not a flashpoint, not an ally bound by rigid blocks, not a dependency trap, just reliability. That neutrality wasn't accidental. It was leverage. As trade volumes adjusted and capital committed, habits formed, shipping schedules normalized, contracts lengthened, skills developed locally, infrastructure anchored new behavior, and once that happens, reversals become expensive. This is why the real shift didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. By the time observers begin debating influence, the structure is already in place, the movement already occurred, the advantage already compounded. The United States remains present but in a more competitive arena. China remains embedded but not dominant. Kenya remains non-aligned but increasingly indispensable. That configuration matters. Because the next phase won't be about who invested the most but who adapts fastest to a world where power flows through logistics, standards, and reliability rather than declarations. Kenya didn't become important by demanding attention. It became important by making itself unavoidable. And the longer this quiet competition continues, the harder it becomes to change the outcome because the future of global trade is already being rooted through places few were watching closely enough. That's the real discovery, not what was found but where the world is now choosing to move.